Okay, hello everyone. My name is Sam Shonkoff, and I am a professor here in the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And I am so pleased to welcome all of you here. We wish we could see your faces, but we see your names, we see numbers. This is our second program in a series that we're hosting called Conversations at CJS that bring together scholars whom we want to hear from, and also really with an emphasis on conversation, discussion, really leaving ample time, ample room for these conversations to happen. This program today is called Homeland, Exile and Diaspora, Contemporary Jewish Reflections. And I am just thrilled to welcome Daniel Boyarin, Jill Hammer, and Susanna Heschel here for this conversation today. I'll introduce all three of them in a moment, and we'll get a chance to hear opening reflections from each of our distinguished speakers today, and then open it up for discussion. I think we're living in a time right now where regardless of the political diversity that I am certain is in the room today, thankfully, that there are times when some of the foundational words and terms in a tradition become constricted, become narrower, and are in need of thinkers, visionaries, seekers, scholars within those traditions to bring some capaciousness, some new dynamism, some new valences to these words, to enliven them, to renew them. And I think Homeland, Exile, and Diaspora are some of those terms in need of attention in the Jewish world today. And I literally cannot think of three individuals whom I would be more excited to hear share some thoughts and some discussion around these. I'll introduce the three of them, and then I will step aside and we'll get a chance to listen here. Daniel Boyarin is Taubman Professor of Talmudic Culture and Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. He has been, among other things, an NEH Fellow a couple times, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, a holder of the Berlin Prize at the American Academy in Berlin, and a Ford Foundation Fellow. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2006. And I'll just add that among his many books, his 2015 book, Traveling Homeland, The Babylonian Talmud as Diaspora, is a book that I recently taught in a course this semester with the same topic as our program today. Welcome, Dr. Boyarin. Jill Hammer is the Director of Spiritual Education at the Academy for Jewish Religion, a pluralistic rabbinical and cantorial seminary in Yonkers, New York. At AJR, she specializes in ancient and contemporary midrash, mysticism, ritual, and contemporary spirituality. Rabbi Hammer is also the co-founder of the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, a program in spiritual leadership for Jewish women. We have a number of Kohanot in our program here at the GTU. As a leader of the Kohenet Institute, Jill Hammer creates and teaches earth-based embodied ritual and study that transforms Jewish conceptions of prayer and ceremony. She also just recently published a book on the mystical text Sefer Yetzirah, which I really can't wait to get my hands on and take a look at. And last but certainly not least, Susanna Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. She's the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, a book that just came up in my teaching yesterday, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany, and Jüdische Islam, Islam und jüdische deutsche Selbstbestimmung. And she and Umar Riyad have just co-edited The Muslim Reception of European Orientalism. She's also edited Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, Essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and she's currently writing a book together with Sarah Imhoff on Jewish studies and the woman question, which we're all eagerly awaiting. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and has held fellowships at the National Humanities Center and the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. She's received 4 honorary degrees and held research grants from the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. Thank you for bearing with me. These 3 speakers today need no introduction, and I will invite them in the order that they appear on the program. So we'll start with you, Daniel Boyarin, please. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks for the invitation and for the introduction. Despite his bad reputation on the question of Judaïté, Sartre captured something vital, and I quote, "The Jew cannot choose not to be a Jew. To be a Jew is to be thrown into, to be abandoned to the situation of a Jew. And at the same time, it is to be responsible in and through one's person for the destiny and the very nature of the Jewish people," end quote. And Sartre continues, "The authentic Jew makes himself, themself, a Jew in the face of all and against all." Lest there be any misunderstanding, neither Sartre nor certainly I are attempting an assault on the absolute juridical liberty of any Jew to take up or deliver themselves of this responsibility. The most common way, however, of entering a family is to be born into one, thrown into the world, as it were, always already with these connections that Sartre notes are characteristic of Jewishness, marking its difference from a Christian thinking in which the infant is essentially an autonomous monad. The Talmud already said this: an Israelite, even were they to sin, remains an Israelite. Franz Rosenzweig draws this out to a philosophical limit point, writing famously or infamously, quote, "It, the people of Israel, does not have to hire the services of the Spirit. The natural propagation of the body guarantees its eternity," end quote. Correctly glossed by Rosenzweig scholar Haggai Dagan as, quote, "the Jewish people does not rely upon the Spirit in the Hegelian sense, nor upon intellectual or ethical uniqueness, nor upon one or another mental quality, but upon blood ties and natural procreation alone," end quote. This is not to say that the relocation of the Jews from a place-based to a generation-based genealogical belonging does not pose problems at the same time that it is powerfully liberating from other kinds of problems. Oppression can shift from external others to internal others, for example, to women. The most obvious site where that occurs is the mark of circumcision, that covenant placed into the flesh, insofar as flesh is penises, surely seems to exclude women. The very fact that Jewishness can only be conferred by a Jewish mother, only the son of a Jewish mother is to be circumcised, not the son of a Jewish father, carries some counterforce. But this hardly seems a sufficient response on its own. This community, rooted in blood, is first and foremost the responsibility of the woman who gives birth, who gives life, says Rosenzweig. This is not, of course, any kind of a feminist message or even amelioration. Circumcision, like matrilineal genealogy, is a cultural inscription, a representation, not itself a fact of being engendered, or even a fact of gender, but that which represents such differences. One who is born a Jew also is born into the community of Jews, the Jewish nation. Benedict Anderson famously defined nations as imagined communities, but he imagined his imagined communities in space, a family, their neighbors, then the people of the next valley, and then all the valleys, all the way to Paris, are part of such a community. Where space functions, as Professor Heschel Zatzal reminded us, time functions for Jews. It is formed, the Jewish nation is a community imagined in time, not space. It is formed from my connection with my grandmother, to her mother and grandmother, and hers until I have included all the generations in my imagined community in time, all the way back to Mother Sarah and her consort Abraham, of course. Unlike a community that is formed in space, which can retain its identity while changing over time, expanding or contracting, what is formed in time exists and retains its identity only by repetition. As anthropologist Eng-Seng Ho puts it, quote, "What matters is that the dispersed understand themselves to be linked by bonds, usually those of kinship. Such bonds exist and endure rather than atrophying only so long as people continue to speak, sing, recite, read, write, narrate, and otherwise represent them." Now, Ho was not speaking about Jews. He was speaking about a community of Muslims, in fact. For Ho, as for Rosenzweig, as for nearly everyone, the bonds of kinship are taken somehow as the foundations, the object of the representations. More or less, as for most who think about it at all, sexual dimorphism or multimorphism has been taken as the biological ground for gender. Even Rosenzweig's radical and non-racist existentialism is based on the same fundamental structure. The bonds are primary and the representations secondary, almost superstructural. So even though I am with Rosenzweig until this point, arguing against such as Walter Ben Michaels or Kwame Anthony Appiah, that bonds of kinship, I am arguing that bonds of kinship need not be racist nor even racialized, even when these bonds are incredibly powerful, for sure in the case of Jews, but also that there is a grave difficulty, a rupture in the heart of Rosenzweig's work. This obtains because, as articulated lucidly by Dagan, quote, "Rosenzweig attributes great significance to culture and tradition, to ritual and to ways of thinking, even in the case of the uniqueness of the Jewish people. But this does not detract from the definitive nature of what was said above, namely the absolute absence of essence or content in Jewish identity." It may not detract from Rosenzweig's insight and insistence that Judaite is empty of essence. By the way, I say Judaite because I can't stand Jewishness, and Yiddishkeit is Ashkenazo-centric, so I decided on French as the neutral territory. Is empty of essence while attributing great significance to culture and tradition. But the two kinds of descriptions do need to be read together, if not reconciled. And the danger, not the necessity, but the danger of falling into racism is always present, especially when one speaks, as Rosenzweig does, of blood. It is necessary then to take our analysis further beyond Rosenzweig, and in the light of some of the most exciting theorization of sex gender of the last 3 decades, begin to move into a new direction of theorizing about kinship, generation, and diaspora. The direction I offer, which I can only gesture towards here, is performativity, a notion of Judaite in which the Jew is called by other Jews, not by Sartre's anti-Semites, and responds by performance or by resistance to performance. I want then to move beyond even the radically correct insights of both Rosenzweig and Ho, and treat representations as the primary force generating diasporic identities, including the representation that constitutes the imagined community in time, namely kinship. Ho himself hints that the very bonds of which he has spoken are depiction understand themselves, but nonetheless seem to imagine a hierarchy. He seems to imagine nonetheless a hierarchy between the bonds and the narratives that sustain and enlighten them, almost as if the bonds are a real thing distinct from their representations. Paralleling or tracking perhaps the classic move that Judith Butler made vis-a-vis sex and gender, I suggested the bonds themselves are always already, as we used to say, a representation. The ties of kinship that produce the imagined community of the diasporic nation are part and parcel of the representations, produced by the representations and not productive of them. This does not make them fake or invalid, because as anthropologist Paul Rabinow put it pellucidly now a quarter century ago, representations are social facts. After introducing the concept in her now classic Gender Trouble, Butler has returned to it frequently, refining and complicating and ramifying the concept. In one fairly recent iteration, she has written helpfully. In one sense, she explains, it seems possible to conclude first that performativity seeks to counter a certain kind of positivism according to which we might begin with already delimited understandings of what gender, the state, and the economy are. Secondly, performativity works, she writes, when it works, to counter a certain metaphysical presumption about culturally constructed categories and to draw our attention to the diverse mechanisms of that construction. Thirdly, performativity starts to describe a set of processes that produce ontological effects, that is, that work to bring into being certain kinds of realities, or fourthly, that lead to certain kinds of socially binding consequences, end quote. Unpacking and expounding each of these 4 points very briefly will be, I reckon, quite sufficient, more than sufficient, to lay out the uses of performativity I am making in my move beyond Rosenzweig's blood and procreation, a move that I mean as a kind of sublimation and not of erasure. Butler's points 1 and 2 challenge the physical, real, or factual existence of a given cultural category, such as gender, or for my context, Jewhood, and argue for their constructedness by human actors. Points 3 and 4, on the other hand, assert that it is the process of repeated performance of certain practices that constitutes the internal sense of belonging to a category and of constructing it socially as a shared and given identity with binding social consequences. Performity thus delineates a theory and a process. Following the same analysis, I want to claim here that it is repeated and reiterated performance that produces the internal sense of being a Jew, and thus connected, particularly, but not exclusively, with other Jews, and thus constitutes a Jewish diasporic nation. As mentioned before, this move solves, or so I reckon, problems in both Rosenzweig and Ho's theories. For both of these theorists, we explain now in a different manner how representations, practices, are tied to bonds of kinship, understanding that the representations produce the bonds and not merely sustain or vivify them, as Ho has described it. The ties that bind are not lies that bind, although they can be, of course. That's directly against Appia. But rather powerful effects of representations and performances that give rise to the internal and very powerful sense of kinship and identity. Kinship and identity themselves function something like the internal movements that, deriving their power from performance, construct gendered senses of selves as well, according to Butler. Encore Butler. The point is not simply that such an effect is compounded through repetition, but that reiteration is the means through which the effect is established anew, time and again. To understand how this happens more specifically, one would have to, with adequate time, consider the relation between processes of reiteration, reestablishment, and sedimentation in order to sort out the paradox of a process that achieves its effects in both regenerative and accumulative ways. End quote. Precisely. The practices that constitute Jewish identity, and perhaps more broadly ethnic or national identities in general, mutatis mutandis, consist, e.g., of the speaking of Jewish languages or the use of markedly Jewish forms of language. Eat, I ate already, but drink, I'll have a drink, for example. Modes of walking, body language, telling stories, singing songs, as well as the study of Talmud, practicing the rituals of the holidays, eating this food and not that. The sharing of these repetitious performances are what produce kinship bonds. In this fashion, once blood is determined as a representation, Jewish kinship bears comparing with or thinking with queer kinship, and even queer nationhood. None of these apply to all Jews, nor need they. At the very beating heart of such narratives, practices, representations, scripts, doings, all the performances that produce Jewishkeit, another attempt at neologism, are Torah, primarily but not necessarily or only the study of the Talmud, with all of its ramifications for forms of Jewish speech and speech practices, and the performance of the Jewish doings, whether or not they are conceived of as divine commandments. The authenticity, or at any rate the antiquity of this perspective, is perhaps best captured in the pair of Talmudic statements, one that I've cited already. An Israelite, even though they sin, remains an Israelite, on the one hand, and on the other, let them study the Torah without intention, for from studying without intention, they will come to intention. Existence comes first, performance comes next. Belief is almost an afterthought.
Thank you, Professor Boyarin. Before I turn it over to you, Rabbi Hammer, I want to also invite our audience participants, as questions arise for you, feel free to add them into the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen. Bonus points if you ask questions as the program goes that involve multiple speakers, but the Q&A field is open, so please feel free to join us through that channel. Jill Hammer, please.
Thank you so much, Sam. I want to first say how honored I am to be part of this event, to be speaking alongside Dr. Heschel and Dr. Boyarin, two thinkers I admire. I heard Dr. Heschel speak years ago at Brandeis Hillel and was so inspired, and so it's really very special for me to be here. And greetings to you all from Manhattan, otherwise known as Mannahatta in Lenape territory. It's spring here, the crocuses are in bloom, and I'm glad to be with all of you. And I want to talk a little bit about the relationship with not particularly land, but with earth. For me, as a Jewish girl growing up in the Hudson Valley, I found divine presence in the features of the land. The clouds, the rolling hills, the blossoming apple trees, the icicles that hung from the edges of the house. This was a place that I was able to find God in a free way that was not particularly defined by where I was, but rather by my specific relationship to those phenomena of the earth. And at the same time, I also encountered God in sacred text, in the prayers of my local Reform community, in the biblical text, in the Bible that was kept on my night table. And so later on, as I encountered the divine deeply in Torah and liturgy and in the Jewish calendar, I maintained a kind of secondary revelatory experience related to the feeling of deity embodied in the natural world. And so, influenced by modern eco-theologians, I've often written in the last number of years about the need for Jews to have a sacred encounter with the physical world. Not as a veil to be transcended, as it sometimes is for the mystics, but as a place where the sacred can be met. I'm particularly aware of the ways that exile has sometimes created a distance between Jews and the place that they find themselves. And I've been aware of the ways that a disembodied theology has, in many ways, not been ideal for anyone, but particularly for women and people of marginalized genders and sexualities, for Indigenous peoples, or really for any of us in an age when we need to be aware of our impact on the planet on which we live. So I found myself an advocate for Jewish theologies of embodiment, in which God can appear to us in the forms around us, in which God can appear as beings of different genders, as a tree, as the cosmos, and where our sense of belonging has something to do with our physical embodiment in relationship to the earth where we find ourselves. And so for me, this all has implications for the concepts of exile, diaspora, and relationship to land and to earth. What does it mean for our relationship to land if we can find the divine in any clod of earth or anywhere? How do we negotiate the complexities of where we might find ourselves in this generation? And Jewishly speaking, how and why might we choose to come to identify with a broader than national conception of our connection to the planet? And if we were to engage in that global covenant, how might that shift our relationship to the idea of exile, which in its original understanding means displacement from land? And in the classical Kabbalah is a cosmic state in which all beings share in a state of alienation. So I want to give some examples of how we might use ancient Jewish resources to address these complex realities in which Jews and others find themselves in the 21st century. And I want to turn to a text about which I have been writing and thinking, the text of Sefer Yetzirah, which means the book of creation. The date and origin and place of this text are controversial, but let's say, for argument's sake, it was written in the 6th century in Mesopotamia, 6th century CE. And in the last few years, I've been creating a translation and commentary on this text, Sefer Yetzirah, which is a mystical work written in Hebrew, composed of cryptic poetic passages that tell the story of God's process of creation via the engraving of the Hebrew letters. And during this creative process, as God is engraving these letters, which are not only letters, but really channels of creative intention and energy, God is using these letters to form the world in the shape of a temple. It has walls, ceiling, and floor, and it has God at the center pivoting to seal and maintain all of the various structural elements of this cosmic temple. This book, Sefer Yetzirah, is in part a response to exile, likely by Jews of Mesopotamia, in which the temple in Jerusalem has been transcended by a cosmic temple that can be found wherever one is, wherever there's an intersection of space, time, and being. These three realms are the classic elements that Sefer Yetzirah imagines as the three fundamental dimensions of the universe. And wherever there is that intersection of space, time, and being, one is able to be in connection both with the divine and with creation. And so for me, Sefer Yetzirah has several useful themes that are relevant to the creation of a contemporary response to exile, land, and being citizens of earth. And I want to share two passages from the book as a way of reflecting on this. So this first passage is from the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah, and reads, and it's brief, I'll read the Hebrew and then the English. Blum picha miliraber, blum libcha miliharher, ve'imratz libcha shuv lamakom, shekach ne'amar ritzo v'shov ve'al devar zeh nichrat brit. Stop your mouth from speaking, stop your heart from murmuring. And if your heart runs, return to the place, for scripture says, running and returning. Regarding this matter, a covenant was made. So what is happening in this passage? Stop your mouth from speaking and stop your heart from murmuring. When the heart runs, this here means when the consciousness is an interruption to our sacred practice, right? Which those of us who have ever prayed or meditated or even tried to be quiet know happens all the time. So what do we do when our thoughts and constructed stories interrupt the flow of communion with God or with what is? We return to the place. And this instruction, shuv lamakom, return to the place, has many different potential meanings. It is an ambiguous phrase. It can mean to return to the meditative focus, that is to return to one's prayer, to return to one's concentration. And because Rabbinic Hebrew uses the word place as a name for God, the phrase can also mean to return to God. So return to our sense of the divine. And for our purposes today, we could also say that this ancient teaching is telling us to return to whatever place we might be in, to return to the land that we're on in the most authentic and ethical way that we can. I was so inspired by this phrase, return to the place, that I named my book after it. It felt to me like a core insight. And it teaches that when our consciousness runs, we have the option not to invest in whatever story our mind is telling us at that particular moment, but in our embodied experience of being. The process of return from exile in this text is a return to presence. It is a return to conscious awareness of who and where we are, a return to the earth, to the real. And so to me, return to the place is an instruction calling me into presence in my own time and place. And that feels to me so deeply what we as a society need to do right now. And at the same time, returning to the place is also returning to an awareness of divine presence embodied in the physical world. And that awareness transforms our sense of relationship to earth. The text also refers to a state of ritzo v'shov, running and returning, which is a phrase borrowed from Ezekiel that seems to mean, in this context, moving between the state of manyness and the state of oneness. That is, between our individual selves and our connection to all that is, our connection to what is universal, or our connection to the divine, we might say. And this phrase, running and returning, also seems to refer to the meditative process of being distracted and then returning to presence, right? Over and over again. This is an iterative process. It cannot be maintained in a pure state. It can only be returned to. And in this text, the covenant is not a national covenant, or not only a national covenant, but rather a private covenant between God and the practitioner. A kind of promise to return to one another over and over again. Every moment can be a return from exile, or a return to presence where and when we are. To further explore this practice, I want to share one more passage that introduces us to the cosmic temple. And this passage describes the universe as a 5-dimensional construct that includes the 3 dimensions of physical space, the dimension of time, and the dimension of nefesh, which is a Hebrew word that means body and soul at once, and refers to the experience of being a being. And these 5 dimensions are formed out of 10 sephirot, or 10 cosmic dimensions. If you're familiar with the concept of sephirot, these might sound different. They are different. The text reads 10 inscriptions of the void. Their measure is 10, yet they are infinite. Inscriptions is a possible translation of sephirot that I like, but it can also mean 10 dimensions of the void. 10 of them, that yet they are infinite. A depth of beginning and a depth of end, a depth of good and a depth of evil. So here we have beginning and end, that's the dimension of time, good and evil. I don't believe this. Life in the pandemic. Good and evil, the dimension of experience, perhaps also the ethical dimension. A depth of above and a depth of below, a depth of east and a depth of west, a depth of north and a depth of south. So those six are the three dimensions of space. And a singular master, a faithful divine ruler, rules over them all from God's holy dwelling and out to eternity. So this cosmic structure in today's terms would be called a hypercube. One can't really draw it in three-dimensional space. It looks something like this. I'll share my screen for just a moment so you can see a possible rendition of what it might look like. So we have the dimensions of space, but also with time and person all together in a kind of quantum sort of way. And this space, this five-dimensional space, can be understood as a cosmic temple with God at its center. And what is important for our purposes now is that the temple here isn't located in any particular land or any particular holy space, but everywhere we might happen to be. And I'm really moved by this image. And to me, this is an image of the filling of the world with the divine presence. And it reminds me a bit of my experience when I pray in Central Park, in an attempt to root into my connection to the earth that I'm on. Any place I am may have its own specificity in terms of how I relate to that place, how I am or am not connected to it historically, legally, or in terms of ancestry. But any place I am is somewhere in this five-dimensional space, this cosmic temple. And I can bring that with me anywhere I go. It is made for diaspora. No matter what land I might be on, I can bring the cosmic temple with me. And personally, I have a complex history of diaspora as a Jew, for me, made even more complicated by legacies of adoption, conversion, and immigration. But as a body, I cannot be in exile from the world of which I am a part. Rather, I'm called to be in conscious relationship to that world, to return to the place, to find myself somewhere on a continuum of beginning and end, joy and suffering, west and east, up and down. And because I feel about this way about my relationship to the world, my Jewish practice is transformed so that every piece of my practice really becomes about this process of returning to the place and of reiterating the covenant of practice and of being of which I am a part. Do I have 4 more minutes? Yes, okay. So I wanted to give one example of what it might mean to be in one's place in a Jewish practice sort of way. So I want to show an image or two of a ritual that I've taken part at the Isabella Jewish Retreat Center in Falls Village, Connecticut, a project of Chazon. This is a Shavuot, first fruits, early summer ritual, which took place in the biblical period, a ritual of offering the first fruits, and which was innovated to apply to this particular place and the produce that it grows. This ritual is often led, and much of it is innovated by Kohenet Sarah Shamira Chandler. So I want to show you what the procession looks like. This is one image of it. That's us coming down the road with our first fruits and our challah and the first grain of the season. And we also innovated a grain waving dance to honor the particular, that's rye actually, not barley, as it would have been in the biblical period, as a particular way of honoring our relationship to place and our gratitude for the land on which we are. So I wanted to show these two suggest that I don't only think this way, I also try to live this way. And I think that one healing for a sense of exile could be in recognizing that we meet God and or the real wherever we are. And that we have the opportunity for practices that include sustainability, gratitude, and that these can be Jewish practices, and that the sense of distance from place that is often entailed in exile, that Jews of antiquity and today, right, have a way of using that experience of exile not to become more alienated, but in fact to allow our sense of belonging to expand and to root ourselves in the makom, in the place wherever we happen to be. So I'm going to close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill Hammer. I don't normally do this in an academic context, but in light of what you just said, in light of having just heard two brilliant talks, and we have one more, I would love to invite us to actually take a moment with a bit of silence. Just take a few breaths wherever you are. There's 75 of us here right now. But I want us to have full attention and presence for Susanna Heschel's talk in a few moments. I am delighted to turn it over to you, Dr. Heschel, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for the invitation, Sam and Dina and Matthew. I wish I could be with you at GTU in person. It's a wonderful community and I love being there. And I thank you, Daniel and Jill, for what you said. I hope that we can spend more time with these ideas and also discuss with the people who are listening. And I would like to perhaps supplement a little bit with some thoughts about exile and diaspora. But I have to begin by saying that I'm speaking now to you here in the United States just hours after the murder of 8 people in Georgia, 7 of whom were women, and 6 of those women were Asian American women. So with that very much in mind is a moment that brings to mind the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre 2.5 years ago. I have to say that it frightens me for this country. It certainly emphasizes the fact that we're all very much in exile, surely. But it also makes it very clear that it is not possible for women to live without fear of violence in this country. And I want us to keep in mind the psychic burden of living with sexism and with the threat of violence, as well as with, of course, the violence itself. I want to speak today a bit about exile and diaspora and what might be implied by both for our situation as Jews. I think if you ask most Jews about exile, they'll immediately say, yes, we went into exile after the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE. That's the standard understanding. And my students always gasp when I tell them that actually there was no Roman edict of exile from the land, and Jews continued to live there, and in fact wrote a Talmud there, the Talmud Yerushalmi, and they wrote Midrashic texts and so on. So the edict of exile is actually something that Israel Yuval suggests arose in the 5th century by Jews in a kind of competition with Christian supersessionism. So it has a theological significance, but it doesn't have a political or, let's say, a reality existence. We were in the land and we could go to the land. And the fact is that an awful lot of Jews, we don't know the percentage, were living outside the land of Israel long before the Romans entered Palestine. So why do we then have this idea in our minds that we live in exile? And what do we do with that idea? How does it shape us? And what can we do going forward? And what actually is the difference between living in exile and living in diaspora? If we talk about Jews living in Alexandria, in Elephantine, in Rome, in Babylonia, we should say they were in diaspora. And yet we have this notion that we Jews have lived in exile. And I think we're all aware of the political dimensions of that claim that we have been in exile for 2,000 years. And that, I think, goes without saying. But I would say then what interests me is then not just the political rhetoric around this notion that Jews are living in exile, but more the affective dimension, the subjectivity, the emotions that surround this notion of being in exile and the way those emotions are expressed, so that even, for example, at the conclusion of some weddings, someone will step on the glass and break it and say, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem," and so on. As if exile has to be remembered and brought into what is often considered one of the happy days of a person's life. I want to just stay with that for a moment and explain that, Daniel, while I very much appreciate your understanding of the Talmud as homeland, and I very much appreciated what you said about circumcision and women giving birth to Jewish babies and so forth, for me, Talmud is never homeland. Talmud is exile. Why? Simply because of the laws regarding marriage and divorce that are in fact derived from understandings of slavery. I cannot subject my life to the regulations of a bunch of rabbis who will make a decision about whether or not I'm going to have a divorce or receive one from a man who may or may not be willing to give that to me, regardless of whether he's beating me or simply making me unhappy. Why would I turn my life over to him and to them? So the notion of being owned by someone is the opposite of being at home. So there is no homeland in that kind of a legal system that treats me in that way. But I would say when it comes to exile, we not only have the exile of 70, we have the exile, the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, which was indeed, must have been quite traumatic. We read about the feelings in Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon. There we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. And the Psalm speaks about rage as well as longing. It's a jumble of emotions, which actually is what characterizes trauma, that confusion of emotion. And it's that psalm that's become so important in other people's understandings of their own lives, as well as our own. The image of the river that's so important in Langston Hughes in a famous poem, "My soul is grown deep like the rivers." There's a way in which the Bible renders exile a universal experience, also with the banishment of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. But I find let's say in Jewish tradition, that exile becomes an internalized experience, something that defines the inner life. So I'll turn to one of my ancestors, a Hasidic Rebbe, Levi Yitzhak Berditchev, who commented on God's command to Abram to go forward, Lech Lecha in Hebrew, and reads Lech Lecha as go inward, go into yourself, find the authentic inner being, because your Judaism will only be meaningful if it's an expression of your authentic self. You can't be Jewish like other people. My father used to say that would be spiritual plagiarism. We find it in the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who writes, "Who am I without exile?" Such a Jewish poem, because Jews too cling to the idea that we are in exile. And I'm not criticizing that. The question is, what do we do with exile? Darwish writes, "What will we do without exile?" But what do we do with our exile? And so for that, I want to turn to the work of Santiago Slobodski and his work on decolonial Judaism. And there he argues that Judaism has been colonized by a hegemonic Christian West in which Jews have lived, and that's certain Jews, yes. And he says, now it's time to stop defining Jewish philosophy and theology and identity in terms of that Christian West, and forge alliances instead with the displaced, with the dispossessed, those whom European colonialism called barbarians, those who stand outside that community. How can we recover a Judaism that's unsullied by Christian colonization? That's not a post-colonial Judaism, but a decolonial Judaism, where the idea that we are in exile as a response, as Israel Yuval has argued, as a response to Christian supersessionism is no longer important because Christian supersessionism is no longer defining Judaism. Is that possible? So the question is whether we can divorce ourselves as Jews also from the self-proclaimed universalism of Europe, a Christian universalism that actually conceals its colonizing goals, and instead, can we realign ourselves as Jews with the barbarians, with those, in other words, who are disruptive of the West? Why is that important? Because it is with the barbarians that the ethical lives. Can we as Jews live as figures of disruption, rejecting the so-called universal that masks the hegemony of Christian European thinking and politics? How do we do this? Well, what it brings to my mind is a revival of the prophetic tradition. The prophetic tradition, and what do we mean by that? Not the way it was defined by German Jewish thinkers as some kind of ethical monotheism and really the fulfillment of what Kant truly had in mind despite his critique of Judaism. Actually, what I'm more interested in is not just this prophetic message of justice, which is crucial, but recovering as well the prophetic passion. So that religion isn't just a series of propositions or social order or theological statements, or even of ritual performance by itself. What we need is the affect, the emotion, the commitment, the basic human need for engagement with other human beings. And for that, I would say I'd like to see prophetic justice combined with Hasidic passion. Think about a verse from Prophet Jeremiah, who speaks about the messenger of God as a person who stands in the presence of God. What does it mean to stand in the presence of God? First of all, it means not to worry about proofs for the existence of God, not to try to respond to Kant or Hegel or any of the other philosophers, to be a witness. What does that mean? First, I want to say what it doesn't mean. I'm very struck by the wonderful work that's been done about when Jews became white. Brodkin's book in particular is extremely important about what happened in post-World War II America with the wonderful federal subsidies that were offered, but that weren't actually possible for Black Americans who were excluded from the possibility of buying homes in certain neighborhoods and so couldn't take advantage of the mortgage funding that was coming from the federal government. But that's not just when Jews became white. Jews also became white much earlier. And just as an example, in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1841, there was a new synagogue that was dedicated, and it was proclaimed at the dedication that this country, the United States, is our Palestine. This city, our Jerusalem, this house of God, our temple. Charleston, South Carolina in 1841 was a slave trading city. It's very clear that Jews saw themselves as white right then and there. The Jews have not come to grips with the system of enslavement that is imbued in rabbinic law and that has also been part of Jewish life in the plantations, for example, Jewish-owned plantations in the Caribbean, and simply how Jews, like others, whether or not they engaged in slave holding, benefited from a slave holding and slave trading country and world. I have to say, I've often wondered why in all the many, many books written about Spinoza, nobody ever mentions that he was living in Amsterdam, which was a slave trading city. How come no one ever talks about that? How did that affect him and his writing of his ethics? But I'll put that aside for the moment. What I'm interested in is, first of all, how we as Jews can become attuned and gain the epistemic ability to recognize right now the white supremacy of America. I sometimes have the feeling, and I'm sure you're in agreement with me, as the psalmist writes in Psalm 135, they have eyes but do not see. Of course, it's directed against idolaters, but perhaps by turning America into some kind of messianic Zion and overcoming of exile, Jews have actually made ourselves idolaters. What can we do? To decolonize Judaism, what has to be removed, not only the distortions brought by European Christian hegemony, but also patterns of Jewish thought that arose in response, definitions of Judaism. These might include Hasidism's own association of piety with particular sexual repressions, or Zionism's assumption that statehood is going to overcome exile, or the very notion that we do live in exile. Meir Kahane once noted that removing Jews from exile is easier than removing exile from Jews. So what do I suggest? What I would like to see is a recognition that we're not in exile, we're in diaspora. What does that mean? What I mean by that is, first of all, recognizing that in Babylon, we lay down and wept. But today, there's no time for weeping. Fascism is looming, authoritarian regimes, massive corruption, racism that's recognized now as a public health crisis, women living with the psychic threat constantly of violence against them. Anti-Semitism is growing, and yet it's cynically manipulated by some Jews for political gain. There's a gap between the wealthy few and the impoverished many that makes me feel during this pandemic like I'm living in a world that is one big slave plantation where I can live in my home and do my work on Zoom while there are all these people out there risking their lives with this horrible virus to make it possible for me to live in my comfortable home. All right, so what am I interested in? I'm interested in the diasporic because I see that as the prophetic position. The marginality of diaspora as prophetic means the lonely but very loud voice of justice, compassion, and hope that constitute the promised redemption. So Jeremiah says, they know no bounds in deeds of wickedness. They judge not with justice the cause of the fatherless, the rights of the needy. Shall I not punish them for these things, says the Lord? And shall I not avenge myself on a nation such as this? Justice, according to the prophets, justice is the ultimate expression of God, not wisdom, not magnificence, land, glory, not even love, but justice. That's where redemption comes from. That is, in fact, redemption. So what I'm suggesting is that the diasporic Jew, the diasporic position is the prophetic position. It means not identifying with the seat of power and not being in exile, sort of alone and quivering in the corner. Diaspora transforms exile into Jewish creativity, into a Jewish voice for justice. The prophet is a diasporic exemplar. The prophet leaves home in some village somewhere and goes to the urban seat of the political, military, and economic power to demand an end to corruption, to exploitation, cruelty, and indifference. The prophetic position cannot exist by trying to end exile with statehood or by embracing exile as the essential mentality of Jewishness. And to abandon diaspora in favor of exile is to walk away from the prophetic. To reject exile while embracing diaspora is to retain the prophetic passion for justice and to give it voice in our world. Thank you.
Ooh, thank you, Susanna Heschel. Thank you, Daniel Boyarin and Jill Hammer. We've got a fire going with everything you three have stoked it with. I want to begin with the three of you and just see if there are any questions, comments from having spoken and listened to one another where you would like to get us going here.
Well, I would just like to say that I very much appreciate, Jill, the connection between the natural order, between the earth and the ethical. I think that's a very important point that you made. And the way you show it in terms of Sefer Yetzirah is also really great. Thank you for that. Yeah. I guess I find Jewish mystical texts speak to me in a way that rabbinic arguments over law never have. That's just me, perhaps. And perhaps it is simply the alienation that comes from knowing that people like me have been excluded from that world for so long.
Thank you for that. I'm still really sitting with the thought of the prophetic as an exilic, exemplar. It's really quite powerful to me that the prophet is, in some ways, in exile because of what the prophet perceives. I found that to be really powerful, and I loved, Susanna, your connecting of, where are we going to look for our solidarity? Are we going to look for it sort of in the powers that be? Or are we going to look for it in, in the dispossessed? And to me, that connected back to something that that Dr. Boyarin was saying around the creation of kinship, the creation of kinship. That we have the opportunity to choose how we're going to do that, and to me that felt connected to your thought around how we decide to choose what we're allied with. So thank you, Dr. Heschel.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in some of our audience members here. And I will start with one pointed question as the clarifying terms. Professor Boyarin, can you say more about your discomfort in using the word Jewishness to make sure that we're proceeding here in a way with understanding what you're meaning by these other terms that you brought forward?
I guess two things. First of all, it sounds so parva to me, so shallow. Jewishness, this state of being Jewish, and I want a term that has more passion or more capacity for passion. And I think even just the strangeness of using a French word. I tried to coin Jewishkeit, but it still sounded too Ashkenazi. So I finally just felt, I've been reading Fanon and Césaire lately quite extensively, and they of course refer all the time to Judaite. So it somehow became charged for me. But I might say something else. I think, Susanna, you really undoubtedly, with the best will in the world, both misinterpreted and distorted what I said. I never referred to, very consciously, to fealty to halacha, and I never referred to Talmud as determinative of practices of Jewish life or practices of. I talk about the Talmud itself as a field of study, as a practice of study, and to which I would certainly say there are now, and have been for a few decades now, no bars on women entering fully, and they have entered fully. And that has changed the Talmud. If the Talmud is understood as the practices of study around it and the sociality that produces, that has changed completely since when I was a student at JTS.
Now, may I say that I, of course, understand that for you, the laws are not determinative, and you're, in fact, one of the most important figures in bringing women to study of Talmud and to also calling constant attention to issues of gender in all of your work. So I'm not saying that. I was simply saying that I believe that you referred to study of Talmud once as a kind of homeland, the act of studying. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, what I mean, of course, is a diaspora homeland, precisely.
yeah.
In other words, a space that is shared among Jews all over the world, from which all kinds of practice and identity, including especially and necessarily the kinds of political and ethical activity that you call for, can be generated.
Yes, I think knowing you that we're on the same page, actually. So I was simply saying that for me, it's not the legal arguments that I find appealing. It's the Gothic passages and it's Jewish mystical tradition where I feel I'm spoken to. But that's, as I say, I'm not making that as a common rule for Jews. That's simply how I react. But one of the problems for me with the legal system, some of the assumptions regarding women that do exist in the Talmud, and some of the ways the laws are constructed, not that they're determinative. I agree with you. I can't accept it. I can't accept a legal system that doesn't give me the freedom to leave a situation where I am in physical or emotional danger, especially not given the way this world is turning out to be with the violence against women. And I would say, in fact, that we have a responsibility as Jews to think about whether we, in our religious texts, are contributing to a society that allows violence like this to occur. So perhaps we need to pay attention to our texts. You know, I remember when the news about Harvey Weinstein broke in the newspaper, and I couldn't go to my regular Orthodox synagogue. I went to the egalitarian minyan, assuming that people would talk about it. And the parsha was Chayei Sarah, was about the death of Sarah. What does Abraham do? He finds her burial, etc. And then he goes off with his concubine and makes babies with her. And I thought that whoever would speak would talk about Harvey Weinstein and harassment and sexual abuse and assault and so on, and link it somehow to what we were just reading from the Torah. And it didn't happen. And I was upset. And I'm just hoping that the rabbis and ministers and priests and imams and anyone who's leading some kind of prayer service this week is going to talk about what happened in Georgia and ask us, all of us listening, what do we have to do? What do we have to do? And we have to change. We've asked Christians to change their teachings about Judaism. And now we Jews have to change our teachings about women. And that's what Jill is doing. That's what her life is about. And that's what each one of us needs now to take responsibility. It's late, but it's not too late. And we have to start doing that. But I feel I'm in complete agreement with both of you. But feel free to disagree with me. It's okay.
Thank you. I want to follow this thread right now. Susanna, with your emphasis, this very moving emphasis on the prophetic as diasporic, as barbarian, as the one standing outside, this sense of disruption, of being an agitator, not being identified fully with the powers that be, while also not crying in the corner, but inhabiting that liminality, to push, to raise questions, to transform. I'm interested, Jill, with your emphasis on shuv lemakom, like on this return to place, but also ratzov v'shov, like the flitting back and forth that I wonder if I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how a return to presence, a return to a sort of earth-based realness, squares with what Susanna is pointing out about the spiritual, ethical importance of displacement, we might say, of a sense of unrootedness, or somehow a more liminal place. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've really been sitting with that as I've been listening to Susanna speak. I think it's an important question. I'm really grateful to you for convening this amazing conversation. What I would say about it is, for me, the prophetic is also emplaced. That in order for us to speak in a way that has truth, and we have to be aware of where we are coming from, right? What we are speaking about, who we are speaking for. And, often we think about it as something that outsiders do, right? Outsiders bring critique, right? Outsiders, speak about the marginal. But in fact, that's only because of our lens that we're looking at it, right, that way. That if we actually take the lens off of sort of dominant society and culture and we move it, right, then it's not about outsiders. It's actually about people who are speaking from their experience, right, in their place, in their moment. So I don't think those things are contradictory. I think it's just a question of how we think about the lens. And, I have found that attempting to speak truth when it's not an easy moment to speak truth, something I know everybody here knows something about, really requires a sense of place. It requires a sense of presence and belief that I have the right and calling to be myself, and to speak what I witness. Or what we witness, right? To use a more collective way of speaking, which we might in fact prefer. So I don't see those two things as contradictory, but I do think maybe they can support one another. That's my sense.
Thank you. I want to note that we have like 3 or 4 questions with people expressing a strong desire to like be able to hear these papers again, to somehow like retrieve because they're moved. So I do want to assure our audience that this is being recorded and you will have access to these if you want to listen again and share. I want to share a question here from Zebulon Hurst, one of our great student scholars here in the GTU community. And Zebulon asks, how do you see the reflections, well, first of all, thank you deeply for your sharing today. Zebulon communicates, how do you see the reflections discussed today, including points you yourselves have made, as well as those of your colleagues, impacting how you approach Pesach, the holiday of Passover? That is just around the corner. Of course, a significant holiday in narratives of diaspora and in the tradition. So.
So I would just urge, us not to understand Pesach and liberation from slavery as something triumphal. I would urge us to think of ways in which we are Pharaoh. I would like us also to, let me suggest something. In chapter 10 of the book of Exodus, at the very beginning of verse 1, God tells Moses, Boel Paro, go, come to Pharaoh. And then God says, Ki ani hichbadati et libo, because I have, this is the conventional translation, I hardened his heart. But actually, there's a wonderful commentary by Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev who points out that the root of the word hardened is also the root of the word for honor and dignity, kavod. It means heavy, it means hard, but it means honor and dignity. And if you look around verse 16 or 17, I remember Pharaoh says to Moses and Aaron, Chatasi, I repent, I sinned. He's repenting. And what Levi Yitzchak says is read that first verse, not that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but rather that God made Pharaoh capable of feeling dignity and honor. And that's what led him a few verses later to say, I sinned. I made a mistake. And maybe that would give us a different sense of what it means to be liberated and what it means to be, in some sense, not just Pharaoh against the Israelites, that Pharaoh is a hard-hearted person or that God would do that. No, that it's more complex than that. And there are ways in which we are both. We're Pharaoh, we're the slaves. We've been liberated and we're still imprisoned. And we imprison ourselves. And we do that with the racism, with sexism. We do that with the society that we have. And we do that with our failure to recognize, to see what's going on around us and to do something about it. Just as too many people sit down for the Seder and they stop after half an hour. No. Read the whole thing. The Haggadah is incredible, and so are the commentaries, and think about it. So that's my Passover wish.
Jill, I see your wheels turning.
All right. I mean, there's a funny contradiction in Passover, right? Because in some ways it's the holiday of eternal exile. It's like every spring we have to return to this story about how we were enslaved and, we had to be freed. And I love everything that Susanna said about seeing ourselves as the other characters too, right? We're also Pharaoh, right? We're not only the ones who are liberated. But in relationship to some of the things that I shared, part of, for me, what's relevant about Pesach is that in some ways we're using, the energy of the earth to help us with our sense of liberation and the possibility of freedom, right? There's a reason why Pesach is in the spring. Right? There's a reason why Passover is in the spring, right? Because we're seeing the growth of something new, right? And that gives us a sense of hope. It gives us a sense of uplift, and it's the right time to be telling those stories and to be thinking about new possibilities. And I guess I would say around, one thing that we might think about this year in terms of Pesach is, we have things on the Seder plate that we don't talk about. We have like the egg, which actually doesn't have liturgy around it, but it has something to do with life. And right now, we could think of our earth as being enslaved, right? We have a planet that is constantly being made to do more labor than it's really able to do, right? To support like the life that's on it. I mean, the planet will probably be fine, but it's not very good for us. So what if we thought about a Seder, in which we talked about the greens and the egg on the Seder plate, and we said, what are the ways that we need to be in partnership, right, to liberate our whole, literally our whole world, right, the humans and everything. So that's a piece that feels very relevant to me. I'm alive.
Thank you. Sorry, please.
There's something very different about the way I approach these things, and I've been thinking and writing a lot in the last few years. And it's not antithetical, but it's different. my conception of my conception of Jewish existence is that it itself is very precious to me. And I want to see Jewish existence continue and thrive and be vibrant. And I'm not saying that anybody else here doesn't. That's not where the contrast is. But for me, it's not an essence of Judaism to be prophetic or to be even righteous. There's just been too much Jewish history of exploitation of so many different ways. So I don't want to claim the Jewish tradition for my righteousness, in a sense that's the tension. In order to justify, to make sense of this deep desire that, and here I'll just revert to my native language, that Yiddishkeit continue, it has to be, in my view, made ethical. It has to. The price of the an unethical existence for Jews and for the Jewish people is unsupportable. And if it cannot be made consistent with the deepest ethical commitments to the land, to gender equality, to racial justice in America and economic justice in America, and to justice for the Palestinians, which is in some ways our sharpest responsibility. Right? Then Yiddishkeit cannot be sustained. So it's Susanna's right that in a sense we agree. We have, I think, all of us very similar political, ethical commitments, perhaps with some different emphases here and there. But I'm just somehow not capable of resonating deeply with the idea of Yiddishkeit as the source of redemption. It is itself, for me, a value, great value, that has to be saved from its possibilities for generating evil.
Thank you, Daniel. So many good questions here. I want to choose one for our next one from Joshua Shaughness. Welcome, Dr. Shaughness, to the room. This question is: Are we rehashing the central question of modern Jewish life? That is it a choice between power and ethics because of an inherent incompatibility of the two? Power and ethics. The emphasis on diaspora that we've seen, different faces of this throughout our conversation are pointing to perhaps this ongoing question of, can there be, is there something about being on the margins, being not aligned with the powers that be in some way, that is the kind of vibrant epicenter of prophetic ethics? Or is there perhaps a different perspective that some of you have here?
Well, I would say, and it's always great to hear from Josh. I would say that power is not necessarily unethical or in necessary contradiction to the ethical. Actually, one can do some great things with power. The power of words, of ideas, the power of love. Political power, too, can be used for good. But we, at the same time, need the prophetic to remind us, perhaps, to keep us in line, to keep us going. I guess what comes to my mind is when Ernst Troeltsch, the German theologian, sociologist, gave a lecture attacking Hermann Cohen in Berlin in December of 1915. And it was an attack on the prophets. And he was making fun of it. The prophets, who are country bumpkins, they have no idea how to run a world. And then they come and talk about don't make war anymore, how absurd. And this is in the middle of the First World War, when all these European countries are taking their young men and sending them off as cannon fodder just to be slaughtered throughout Europe. And that's how he was talking. So I think we do need not only a prophetic tradition, but we also need people who remind us of the prophetic tradition. And keep in mind why it is the German theology, German Protestant theology, not the Jews, but German Protestant theology was not interested in the Hebrew prophets. What impact did that have politically? There was no resource for people to stand up in Germany and say no to World War I, and no to Hitler, of course, and no to anti-Semitism. So it's not power necessarily, but I do think that the failure, and I know, Josh, what you're thinking of too, the failure and the horror has been when Jews align themselves with those at the highest levels of power and then fail to speak in the prophetic voice. That's the horror.
So, while echoing and seconding all of that, I want to add one thing, which is that to me, the idea that we could choose between power and ethics is sort of an overly disembodied idea. You know, from the embodied point of view, we cannot avoid power, right? As long as we're breathing, we have capability, right?
Yes.
And we have to deal with the ethical implications of that.
But the word power has to be understood in all its equivocality. There's a difference between thinking of power in the way that Mayor Kahana, for instance, thought of power, and less egregious examples also. Jews have to have power. We have to have power in order to protect ourselves or whatever, and power that is shared with other people, which is exactly the diasporic condition of power. And I don't need the prophets, you know. I can look into other kinds of historical models. By the way, the prophets weren't so good to their wives either. You know, or is Ezekiel good on women? You know, no, I'm not saying that to dismiss the prophets. I'm just saying that there is a kind of heteroglossia in all the forms of Jewish textuality, and probably in all the forms of human textuality. Yeah, okay. In the end, I'm the defender of the Talmud.
I am sad, but clearly seeing that we are at the end of our time. I want to be mindful of the time of our speakers and of all of the other people present here. Thank you so much to all three of you, Susanna Heschel, Daniel Boyarin, Jill Hammer. It has been a real honor to learn from you and with you. Thank you to all of the rest of you who are here for coming, and Chag Sameach to those who are going to be celebrating. And I think we're all leaving here with a lot of food for thought and inspiration. So, thank you so much.